Let me begin by thanking the C21U staff for putting this together. As I mentioned, we didn't do this the last couple of years because of the pandemic, so it's great for us to be back. I think this is our 10th one of these. We should be on number 12, but we were out 2 years. So thanks particularly to Nicole and Brittany and Molly, who did a lot of work putting this together, so thank you for that. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about C21U and again a broader perspective of that. And I'll begin where everything begins these days, and that's with the pandemic. And what the pandemic has pointed out to us, and I'm going to lose this name tag because it gets in my way. One of the things the pandemic has pointed out to us is how globally interdependent we are. And we've known this for some time. You know, Thomas Friedman's world is flat. There are a lot of references, but this really pointed it out. When the World Health Organization first identified a new unknown virus in Wuhan, China, it was only 3 weeks from that point to where already there were infections in 25 countries. And by that point, the pandemic had spread. So it happened, we were really connected. That's an example of a negative interdependence that we have, a global negative interdependence. But we also, I think the pandemic realizes there's a positive interdependence as well. And that's some of the discussion you heard earlier about how rapidly we were able to develop ameliorative techniques, to eventually develop a vaccine, to develop tracking systems, and we did that as a global basis. So this world we live in is increasingly interdependent world, and we are very much a global university. We don't think of ourselves that way, and this focused on cities, but we have a very global presence, and it's up to us to help make that presence be worthwhile. But I don't want to talk about the pandemic. First, I want to prime you with a question, thinking back to your Sesame Street days. Remember that one of these things is not like the other? Here you go. I don't want you to answer this yet. I just want you to think about it. Just think about it for now. Limes, lemons, and polar bears. One of those things is not like the other. And we'll come back to this in the end, and I'll actually get the answer from you. But get that in your head to begin with. What I want to talk about is a different disease, and that is scurvy. Do you have scurvy? Now scurvy was a scourge of sailors for thousands of years, literally thousands of years. And it's very informative for us today about how we can approach some problems. And by the way, looking at number 7, 8, and 9, and your hunger is constant, you're cranky, and people do not like you, I may have scurvy. I think it's possible. But beginning about 1500 BC, the Egyptians wrote down the symptoms of scurvy. They said, oh, look, our sailors are getting this weird disease, and we don't know what's causing it. It took almost 3,000 years later before people began to come up with a solution for it. Vasco da Gama, in his ship's log, wrote that, hey, if I give the sailors citrus, they don't get scurvy. And said, oh, great. Didn't take. 100 years later, Richard Hawkins wrote the same thing down in his log. Wow, I've just discovered that if I give the sailors citrus, they don't get scurvy. Didn't take. Another 150 years later, James Lynn, who worked for the British Navy, actually did controlled studies and said, okay, these people get citrus, these people don't. Oh, look here, the ones that didn't get the citrus got scurvy, the ones that got the citrus didn't get scurvy. So there you go. But it still took 50 more years before the British Navy said, okay, let's give all the sailors citrus on the ships. So very slow diffusion and adoption process. That worked, though. More or less. I mean, scurvy was almost completely eliminated in the space of about 10 years. And the British sailors ate limes, but back then they called lemons limes. So they were really eating lemons, but they called them limes, and that's why British sailors are called limeys, because they were the ones that primarily did this. So scurvy almost completely eliminated, but then due to the Napoleonic Wars, they actually did switch to actual limes because they couldn't get the lemons very well. So they started using limes again and not lemons at all. And things still went fine for another 15 years till the British Arctic expedition was stuck in the ice for 3 years up near the North Pole. And they got wiped out by scurvy. Now they had plenty of lime juice that they were drinking down, and they couldn't figure out why are we getting this scurvy. It doesn't make sense. Because up to this point, no one knew what caused scurvy. No one knew what it was. It's a very simple disease we know today. It's just a vitamin C deficiency. But they didn't know vitamin C existed, and they didn't have any clue other than, ooh, let's do this thing, and it seems to fix it. Then A few years later, the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition noticed another thing. They also were doing a polar expedition, and part of the group pushed on to get to the North Pole. Part of the group stayed on the ship. Now, the group that pushed on to the North Pole hunted polar bears, and that's what they ate. They didn't want to carry a lot of food, so they would hunt polar bears and eat them. They tasted horrible, apparently. I don't know if any of you have ever had one, but that's what they said. The people on the ship refused to eat the polar bears because they tasted so bad. They didn't want to eat them, so they ate the stores that they had stocked in the ship all the years prior. The people on the ship got scurvy. The people pushing to the pole didn't get scurvy for that. Why was that, and why was scurvy fixed for a while and not fixed? Well, there were some other factors that came into play. One was, during this period around the 1860s, shipping got a lot faster. And so the ships just weren't out on the water long enough for the people to get scurvy. It takes only a tiny bit of vitamin C to prevent scurvy, a very, very tiny amount. And the ships were not gone long enough to get it. It wasn't until they started getting the polar expeditions, and now they're stuck for 3 years on the ice, scurvy came back. So we had masked the problem. The second problem was limes have about a third of the vitamin C that lemons do. And so when they switched from lemons to limes, the amount of vitamin C dropped. But they were even more efficient because they decided that they would really process the lime juice, and they ran it through these copper pipes to distill it so they could carry just more of the essence of it. When you put lime juice in contact with copper, completely wipes out the vitamin C. There's nothing there. Turns out, though, polar bears have vitamin C in them. And so the group that was out there hunting the polar bears, they were getting plenty of vitamin C from eating the polar bears, when the people drinking the lime juice didn't get that. They still didn't know this, right? They hadn't put it all together yet, and they still didn't know what caused scurvy. So the Scott expedition to the Antarctic in 1902, he was determined no one's going to get scurvy on this expedition. So he stocked all the lime juice in the copper. He made sure his food was good. There were two competing theories of what made scurvy. One was bacteria. Bacteria was kind of a new thing, and they thought, oh, maybe bacteria causes it. The other was a little more mysterious, something called ptomaine, which was spoiled food, basically, for that. Well, Scott gets to the South Pole, and he's not to the South Pole, but to the Antarctic, and he's got everything nailed down to a science. He's really worked on it, but to his horror, everybody started getting scurvy. And he said, okay, this is bad. We're going to fix this. I think it's bacteria. We're going to clean everything out. So they completely emptied the ship. They let sunlight down in. They scrubbed everything. They washed the clothes. No effect. They still got scurvy. So then he said, okay, well, it must be the ptomaine. That must be the theory that works. So we're not going to eat any of our canned food anymore because that's all spoiled. That's given us scurvy. So they started hunting seals, which they had down there, and they shot the seals and ate the seals, and turned out to work. That fixed the scurvy. So it must have been the ptomaine that did it, because the seal meat cured it. Seals have vitamin C also to that. They still didn't know really what was causing it. They still had misinterpreted the solution. And it wasn't until 1907 when two Finnish researchers were looking at another disease called beriberi. And they did a study on dogs and fed the dogs a certain diet, which didn't include any vitamin C. And the dogs didn't get beriberi, and they didn't get scurvy either. And so they said, aha. So they didn't really think about scurvy. They were just thinking about beriberi. Then they said, well, let's replicate this in a different species. Let's do it in guinea pigs. And so they got some guinea pigs and fed the guinea pigs the same diet as the dogs, and the guinea pigs didn't get beriberi. But they did get scurvy. It turns out that only 2 animal species on the planet get scurvy. One of them is primates. The other is guinea pigs. Just by chance, they had picked the only other species that get scurvy. Then they developed the whole vitamin C theory, and they worked it out, and we finally today we almost never have scurvy around anymore. So why do I talk about all that? Well, because it's a good story. I mean, it's worth talking about. But B, because think about if education is like scurvy. Where are we in understanding this? Scurvy was simple. I mean, it's just a simple one vitamin C deficiency. It's just a one-item thing. It takes only a tiny bit. Education is complex. I mean, it's really, really hard to know all of the factors that are engaged in education. We really have no idea still. We do stuff, and it seems to work, so we keep doing it. But are we really just giving people lime juice with no vitamin C in it? We don't really know a lot about that. So part of our research in aloe and other aspects is helping us figure that out. So at C21U, that's kind of where we are. We're sort of a research organization. We really try to figure out what's down at the level of how people actually learn, and how do we make change to do that. So this talk, this symposium today, focused on higher education, and also K-12 we talked about a little bit, and that's a super complex system. So there's so many pieces to it. You know, many of us have spent our entire lives trying to figure it out. What I thought I'd do, though, is just give you a little bit of our approach to how we work on this, and then tell you some specific things that we're working on, and we'll wrap up. We take very much a design research perspective when we do our research. So we have a real problem that we're trying to solve. So, you know, we're trying to get people not to die of scurvy with them. We look at the theory, what's out there, what do we know about this, and then we try to build a solution based on the requirements of solving the problem. So how do you improve graduation rates is a real one. So there are theories about that. We actually build things and try it. And then our goal is, A, to solve the problem. We implement it. We analyze it. We also, though, want to inform theory. So we try to really do things in a scientific basis. So as we get some understanding of the problem we're looking at, can we inform the theory so we have a better, and we begin to approach the idea of vitamin C. We can get to the concept of where vitamin C is. So that's our basic philosophy. So we have real projects that we work on and try to inform theory for them. The other thing we try to do, though, as you've heard here today, it's a very complex system. And much of what we've been talking about is societal change. And we would like to change society. We know we want to make things better. How do you do that if you're just us? Well, I got this from Rich DeMillo, who founded C21U, and he got it from Buckminster Fuller, who you may know. So Buckminster Fuller, this is his grave there. On it, he has a headstone that says, "Call me Trim Tab." And it turns out to be a really meaningful concept. A trim tab is a little piece of metal on the back of a rudder. So if you look at a big ship, they have these rudders that just weigh tons and tons and tons. And as the ship is going, there's so much water pressure on each side, it's very hard to move that rudder. It just takes an enormous amount of energy to do it. I'm sure you engineers could tell me exactly how much energy. But what they discovered was, if you put a mini rudder on the back of the big rudder, you can move that very small rudder, and that little small rudder creates an area of low pressure. And when you create the area of low pressure, it enables you to move the big rudder very easily. So that's also sort of our mindset. You know, we look for very small projects that, sometimes not small, but generally small projects that we think can create opportunities for change. We think they can create areas where we may be able to have an influence. So that's our sort of our design philosophy. The other thing we like to do is think about the future. And so if you do future studies, there's something called the cone of plausibility, which came out of the military. So you look at now, and you look at sometime in the future, and you have what's possible, what's plausible, what's probable, and what's preferable. So a lot of times we just let this go, and we end up somewhere in the plausible maybe. But we want to try to steer, using our trim tab idea, to get to the preferable future. Now there's always wild cards, the sort of black swan events, if you're familiar with that terminology, and pandemic was one of them, that changes things around. So we're aware of those, but we try to give at least some ideas of how those could affect things. So generally, we look at stuff that's happening. And so over here on the left, you see factors that are influencing where we are now. Then we kind of create future scenarios. What are things that could be happening? What are things that we don't want to happen or do want to happen? And how can we steer us toward some of those ideas? So we make a lot of small bets along the way to at least get us in the right direction of where we want to be in terms of our future state. So here's some of the things that we think are shaping the future right now. Demographics, we've talked about, the demographic cliff. Interestingly, that's in the US. Worldwide, as Bernard and I have talked about, it's the opposite. So the worldwide population is getting more. There are more and more students worldwide who need a higher education. I think there's something like 72 million seats. Paul might know, but there's 72 million seats in higher ed in the US. The worldwide demand is for 720 million seats for that. So, you know, we can't begin to meet that. So that's part of why our scalability work is important. The pandemic certainly had impact. The president has talked about the shift to online education. We were very careful to say the shift to emergency remote teaching because it wasn't online education. It was education that took place online. But real online education takes a lot more work and there's a lot more development to go into it. Future of work, we talked a little bit about that. Pandemic has influenced that. You know, we're telecommuting, we're hybrid more. Automation, we talked about things being replaced. The pace of change continues to increase. in the idea that you could go to college for 4 years and then for 40 years you have that same knowledge stand you in good stead all the while. That doesn't seem to work anymore. Climate change, the president's also talked about, real problems facing us now, and so forth. I'll tell you one that I think about is this the information explosion to the disinformation apocalypse. You may have seen a few weeks ago where the head of the FDA said that misinformation is now the leading cause of death in the United States. And I think we as higher ed, we probably have something to say about that. So what do we do? So I'll just give you some examples of some of the projects we work on at C21U with our fantastic research and development teams who do this. A lot of what we do is based on learning analytics. So as we've discussed earlier in the conference, we take big data, we somehow clean that data up, we analyze it, and then we try real solutions out that may have some impact and if hopefully informed theory along the way. One of the ones we did during the pandemic was a KPI tool, a key performance indicator tool. This is Jonna Lee and her team developed. So the idea here is when we assess learning right now or assess classes, we do an end-of-term assessment for the instructor, so that we call it at Georgia Tech the CIOS assessment. The instructors get that after the semester is over, and they don't really have any time to affect what has just happened. Maybe they could make some changes for the next semester. Well, we thought, can we speed that cycle up? Can we really give instructors near real-time access to information about their classes are going? So we developed this instrument that takes just 30 seconds each week for the students to go in, and it's almost like a mini CIOS in a way, but we don't evaluate the instructor. We evaluate student learning in the class. So and you don't worry about reading all the little stuff there, but the students go in, fill out a quick survey, and the instructor can just at a glance get like a color code of how the class is going. And so the more red something is, the more areas of problem there are. And we do things as the pace of the instruction, how well the students feel like they've learned it, what kind of support they get, how clear things are, and how much they're participating in the class. So very quickly, in near real time, instructors are able to get something they normally only get after the semester is over, and hopefully adjust their instruction. Now, we don't, and we still are running this now. We have a handful of instructors using it. We're going to try and push it out in a bigger way in the fall for that. We also have this, which we don't use because the Georgia Tech faculty don't like this kind of thing. But this is a master view. So if I was a school chair, I can go in and look at every course in my school, every course in my program, and just very quickly get some sort of visual representation of are there problem areas. So in this one, you can see there's a block of red right there. So I could go in and look and see what those courses are that are red, and I think, this course is having some problems. So maybe do they need another teaching assistant in this course, or are there some other thing going on? Could I intervene and not have to wait till the end of the semester when the problem is a giant problem? Now, like I said, we don't use this. We could. I would like to have it. But there are political issues in dealing with real humans as well. But I think it's a useful concept that takes big data and allows us to represent it in a way that could be immediately useful. Another thing we're doing is looking at just-in-time interventions. So particularly with our online learners, we get all the click stream data. So this is what they click on, what they're looking at. We get, I think it's something like a terabyte of data a day that comes in from this. So can we use this data and use machine learning techniques to predict where students are having trouble or which students are likely to succeed and intervene with them early? Now, Georgia State does this really well, by the way, so they've really improved their graduation rates. They'd use a slightly different technique for this. They have like 800 factors they look at, and if a student is flags on so many of those factors, they notify counselors to talk to that student. But this is something that we're continuing to work on and trying to predict student success early in the semester so we can intervene early in the semester and help the students out. Another one is discussion forum analysis. Earlier, Ruth, I think, mentioned Min-Kyu Kim at Georgia State's research. He's researching a model called community of inquiry. So this is the idea that you build learning communities in an online environment particularly. And the community of inquiry model has 3 parts: teaching presence, social presence, and cognitive presence. Now, Min-Kyu is working on teaching presence and social presence. So in other words, if you're in an online environment, how real does the teacher seem to you? Or how real do the other students seem to you? And how much interaction can you have with them? We've been focusing on the cognitive presence part of it. Cognitive presence is about what level of discussion is going on in this online forum. And so is it all just very surface level, has no meaning at all, or is it very deep, higher level discussion that the students are having? Are they really trying to get at the core of the content there? it used to be very difficult, still is very difficult, to determine cognitive presence. What you would do is, again, after a class ended, you would get a team of researchers and go in and take all of their discussion and code it for a level of cognitive presence. Super resource intensive, took forever to do it. What John and her team have been doing is trying to, again, use machine learning techniques to automate this. So now we're able to go in and have our AI Lite, look at the student discussion and instantly say, well, you know what, you thought the discussion was at the exploration, or that's supposed to be resolution, at the resolution level of the discussion, which is the highest level discussion, but it turns out everybody's just still exploring around. You need to do something to get those students from level 2 to level 4 in the discussion. And we can do this in near real time, and I think we're at something like 80%, 85% inter-rater reliability with humans. So you get the human researchers to go in and do this, and our machine learning techniques are getting close to where it's useful for that. Another one we've been looking at is analyzing applicants for potential success. So this is in our Online Master of Science and Analytics program. We get a lot of applicants for that program. In these at-scale programs, the goal for those programs is to allow every student that could succeed to succeed. In other words, to admit every student that could fit in to that. Now that's impossible in our residential programs because we just don't have the space or the resources. In the online programs, we have a much more potential to admit more students. Here's the caveat though. In our residential programs, in our on-campus programs, we admit at a very high level of mastery. So Paul knows what it is, but like, let's say we admit students in the 98th percentile across all students. If we make a mistake, and I'm sure you guys never make a mistake, but if you were to make a mistake, well, now you've admitted a student who's in the 94th level of proficiency. So it's a recoverable mistake, not that bad. In our Online Master of Science programs, though, the OMS programs, we want to admit everybody that can succeed. So we want to admit everybody in the 80th percentile, but nobody in the 79th percentile. And that oversimplifies it, but our goal is to really try to build out these tools to be much more discriminating. As we were doing this research, and that research is ongoing, we came across another thing. We thought one of the things that seems useful to know is what 21st century skills do the students have? And these are generally listed as critical thinking, creativity, communications, and collaboration. And we, again, using machine learning techniques, are able to read the letters of recommendation that the students send in and get some gleaning of understanding of how at least the recommenders think these students fall in 21st century skills. So our goal in this project is to be able for every student to give a dashboard like this and kind of say where they are on 21st century skills to the admissions advisors. So they can then look at the students and build a class that takes into account you don't normally take into. Here's the one I really like a lot, and this gets to discovering vitamin C. And this is looking at, is there objective evidence for learning in the brain? So working with Eric Schumacher in the Center for Advanced Brain Imaging, which is a joint project between Georgia Tech and Georgia State, we actually are taking students and pushing them in the big fMRI machine, the functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, putting them through a tutorial, or actually was using one of David Joyner's classes, and mapping their brain as they do the tutorial. Now, currently our research is based on an older theory of learning called Gagné's internal events of learning, and he says there's 9 things that happen when you learn something. And so we're looking to see, is there objective evidence that the brain activity is going on when each of these 9 things are doing. Now, we used David Joyner's class because it was partially designed using this same theory, so we think we'd see it. This one here is looking at event 3, which is stimulating recall of prior learning. So getting students to think about what they've learned before. And this means something. I don't know what it means. You'd have to ask the neuroscientists about that. But we've run I don't know, about 16 or 20 students so far through this, and we're actually getting results that are significant if only I understood them for that. Another one we're working on is the Digital Credentials Consortium. So once we have students get the credential, whatever it is, what do they do with it? So we're a part of a group with Harvard and MIT and 12 other or 10 other universities where we're trying to figure out what's the next thing after the transcript. So again, we look at all parts of the educational system. When you go to a store to buy alcohol right now and you have to show your ID, what the clerk needs to know is, are you old enough to buy alcohol? But what you're giving the clerk is your home address, your eye color, whether you have any driving restrictions or vision restrictions. You're giving them a lot more information than they need. can we allow the learner to have possession of just some pieces of information and give what they need? And can we also expand out the information the learner has in their control? So for example, say you've got a student who is a great team leader in your class, and you've got team-based projects, and this student just does it perfectly. That doesn't show up on a transcript. The way you'd get it now is you'd write it in a letter of recommendation, but we could put it on a transcript. We could put it on a transcript that is instantly verifiable by any employer or other university that wants to do it. And Stuart's been doing a lot of work on this. And really trying to figure out, is there a new way to do credentials that are robust, shareable, outlive institutions as well? And so right now we've got our team has built this module for Canvas where you can actually go into Canvas and enter stuff in the digital credential that we have. And together with MIT, we've built this EduWallet, which is an app on the App Store. Actually, we don't call it EduWallet anymore because MIT's lawyers said we couldn't. It's a way to do it. What we're working on now is the third piece, which is the verifiable piece, where if you're Google or Amazon and you want to hire a student, rather than going to LinkedIn and saying, oh yeah, they say they can do all this stuff, you can actually click the button and it'll come back and says, yes, Georgia Tech says they can do this stuff. And then the one I mentioned earlier that is another NSF grant we had that Ashok has been working on, the Competency Catalyst Skill Sync. Skill Sync is, again, upskilling, reskilling thing. We go to companies, we look at their job categories, we look at the descriptions of those jobs, and we pull out, using machine learning, we pull out the skills needed to do that job. So we get a list of all the skills. We do the same thing for syllabi, and we pull out the skills offered in those syllabi. And then we can map what students need to do to get the skills they want for a different job. This has been a very interesting project. We are just finishing up phase 2, not sure where we are in phase 3, but we first partnered with Southwire, I think it was, and did a project with them that went really well. And we think this is, again, a good thing for adult learners to be able to very closely map what skills they need for their next job. One that I'm very engaged in is the GT Atrium. So this is the idea of a global physical presence for Georgia Tech. It came about from, initially came about from our online Master of Science courses where we've got students on all continents. We had a student on an icebreaker, so we actually covered Antarctica one time with the students. We found that these students get what they need out of the courses, but they miss some of that socialization aspects that we talked about earlier. They don't really necessarily get the Georgia Tech experience. They tend to be isolated, maybe. And we thought, can we bring these students together? So we thought, can we build like a WeWork for learning, a co-learning space? And our idea was where these students could come into the co-learning space, and they're still doing their online course, but they're with another student who's maybe doing a different online course, and they can interact with that student, they can build social networks, and go from there. What we realized, too, was every building on campus, the new ones all have atria in them. And what happens in those atria? All sorts of things. Students use them for study spaces, sure, but there are job fairs there, there's hackathons. So we really wanted to build a platform that supported our online learners. Well, it quickly turned out there are a lot of other interests in this and a lot of other uses for it. So the co-learning space idea, sure, instead of going to Starbucks, they come to our space to do that. But also professional development. There's a big need for helping these students out with career services. How do we get them in advising? How do we help them with test prep or certifications and things like that? So professional development, advising. The networking idea, it turns out our alumni are very interested in networking with our current students. And so for example, the Bay Area in San Francisco has the highest percentage of Georgia Tech alums outside of Georgia. And they're very interested in meeting current Georgia Tech students to hire them. International has a strong interest in this. And so the international space has been driving a lot of our thinking on the Atrium. We have alumni in really all over the world who want a local Georgia Tech presence. They often want English as a second language. So we're actually working with our Language Institute to help develop those programs as well. And then finally, sort of events. We notice that when we send in our OMS programs, when one of the faculty goes out there, it's kind of like they're a rock star, and the students flock in from all over the place to be physically present with that person. So the physical presence idea, you know, does campus matter, does place matter? It does, but you can't always get to this campus. We have 19,000 students who are all the other places in the world. Can we reach out to them? Currently, we've got several atria under development. The first one will probably be in Taipei. We have a donor in Taipei who's given us a building. We're ramping up the structures we need to operate there. Another one in Medellin, Colombia is very close to development. One in Rabat, was it? Say it again? Marrakesh, sorry, Marrakesh, Morocco. One locally here in Peachtree Corners. The Peachtree Corners City Council voted to give us a building to put an Atrium up there. So this is something I think we'll see coming along. I think we'll open the first doors of this year. And then AI Allo, you've talked about that already. C20U is supporting this in every way that we can for that. So back to this question. Let me wrap up. Which one of these is not like the others? No, it's the polar bear. No, it is the limes. You're right. No, it's the limes. Yes, right. Because polar bears have vitamin C, lemons have vitamin C, limes not so much vitamin C. So what that tells us, I think, is that, and I'll read these, technological advances can mask sometimes an understanding of a lack of understanding of fundamental principles. We have to be very careful in education that we get the next newest thing and we throw it at education and think, okay, we've solved some problem, but we don't really know what the problem is. Changes to one part of a system impact the whole rest of the system. So when the ships got faster, it masked the problem of the vitamin C deficiency. Same thing happens here. If in your house, for example, if you do systems theory and you have your heating system and you set the heat to something, but then you open a window, opening that window changes the rest of the system. We don't think about that a lot in higher ed, but it does. If we change one part of the system, some other part of the system is changing. Admissions, career advising, whatever, housing, or that. And this is a quote that I love that I think I have to keep in mind all the time. A small foundation of evidence often builds a soaring edifice of theory. And we do that all the time. We take just a little thing that we say, aha, this fact, therefore, all of this theory. And we have to be really, really careful with that, particularly working with technology and working with the types of things we do. So all that came from, by the way, this great essay called Scott and Scurvy. And I won't begin to pronounce that guy's name, but if you look up Scott and Scurvy, you'll find this good essay about that. And what he points out, one other quote from this guy, is we tend to think that knowledge, once acquired, is something permanent. Instead, even holding on to it requires a great deal of careful effort. So that's us at C21U. I thank you for coming today. It's been delightful to see you all in person again, and I hope we'll see you next year as we do this again. So thank you.